On August 2, 1985, Delta Airlines Flight 191 became the centerpiece of one of the most tragic and consequential events in aviation history. Departing from Fort Lauderdale-Hollywood International Airport in Florida, the wide-body Lockheed L-1011 TriStar aircraft was en route to Los Angeles International Airport with a scheduled stopover at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, DFW. The journey was routine in Delta's extensive network, connecting passengers to destinations across the United States. However, what started as an ordinary flight ended with an unprecedented disaster that would change the way the aviation industry approached weather-related challenges forever. Delta Airlines was one of the premier carriers in the United States during the 1980s, known for its large domestic network and a commitment to customer service. The Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, introduced in the early 1970s, was considered a state-of-the-art aircraft for long-haul flights. Known for its advanced technology and robust safety features, the L-1011 boasted 3 engines, 2 under the wings and 1 mounted in the tail, making it highly reliable for both passenger comfort and operational efficiency. The aircraft used for Flight 191, tail number N726DA, was well maintained and had logged thousands of hours without major incident. The crew. The cockpit crew of Delta Flight 191 consisted of seasoned professionals. Captain Edward Connors, 57, was a veteran pilot with over 29,000 hours of flight experience. Connors had a reputation for being calm under pressure and meticulous in his pre-flight preparations. First Officer Rudolph Price, 42, was a highly skilled co-pilot with more than 6,500 flight hours. Price was known for his precision and professionalism in the cockpit. Flight engineer Nick Nozick, 43, was responsible for monitoring the aircraft's systems during the flight. With nearly 20 years of aviation experience, Nozick was considered a critical member of the team. The cabin crew included 11 flight attendants tasked with ensuring passenger safety and comfort. Among them were individuals who had served Delta for decades, embodying the airline's commitment to service excellence. The passengers. Aboard Flight 191 were 152 passengers, ranging from business travelers to families heading to Los Angeles for summer vacations. Notable passengers included a group of corporate executives returning from a business retreat, newlyweds embarking on their honeymoon, and a professional athlete on his way to a tournament. Among them was 12-year-old Andy Stevens, traveling with his mother, eager to see Disneyland for the first time. For most passengers, the flight promised a typical cross-country journey. Many settled into their seats, reading magazines or chatting with seatmates, unaware of the weather patterns forming in the skies ahead. The route and operational context. The flight path from Fort Lauderdale to Los Angeles included a critical stop at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. DFW was one of the busiest airports in the country, with sophisticated air traffic management systems and a reputation for handling high volumes of traffic. However, Texas weather in August was notoriously unpredictable, with sudden thunderstorms capable of forming along flight routes. Meteorological forecasts for the region on August 2, 1985, predicted isolated thunderstorms in the vicinity of Dallas-Fort Worth. While such weather was not uncommon, it required heightened awareness and careful decision-making from flight crews and air traffic controllers. The Lockheed L-1011 TriStar. The Lockheed L-1011 TriStar was a wide-body aircraft designed for medium to long-haul routes. With its advanced avionics and redundant systems, the TriStar was considered one of the safest aircraft of its time. It featured innovative safety features, including autoland capabilities, advanced hydraulic systems, and triple redundant flight controls. However, no aircraft design could account for every possible variable in flight, particularly the destructive forces of weather phenomena like microbursts, a relatively poorly understood atmospheric condition at the time. The climate of the 1980s. The aviation industry in the 1980s was undergoing significant changes. While technological advancements had made air travel safer than ever, challenges remained. Weather-related accidents were a primary concern, and the tools available to pilots for detecting severe weather were limited. Radar systems, though effective, often struggled to capture rapid atmospheric changes, such as wind shear or microbursts. The Delta Flight 191 tragedy unfolded against this backdrop, exposing critical gaps in the industry's understanding of weather phenomena and emergency response protocols. These shortcomings would come to light in the aftermath of the disaster, prompting sweeping changes in aviation safety. The calm before the storm. As Delta Flight 191 taxied to the runway at Fort Lauderdale, there was no indication of the calamity that lay ahead. The pre-flight checks were routine, the weather conditions were stable, and the mood among the passengers and crew was relaxed. Captain Connors and his team completed their final preparations, confident in their ability to navigate any challenges along the route. At approximately 2:10 p.m. Eastern Time, Flight 191 took off from Fort Lauderdale, climbing steadily to its cruising altitude of 39,000 feet. The journey westward was smooth, with clear skies for much of the route. Passengers chatted, enjoyed in-flight refreshments, and gazed out at the sprawling landscapes below. What no one aboard Delta Flight 191 could have anticipated was the invisible force awaiting them in the skies above Dallas-Fort Worth. A deadly microburst that would test the limits of human skill, technology, and survival. Delta Airlines Flight 191 departed Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International Airport on August 2, 1985, its passengers and crew unaware of the storm that lay ahead. The Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, a marvel of aviation engineering, climbed steadily into the skies. It was a routine flight, connecting travelers to Los Angeles with a scheduled stop at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. The day seemed ordinary, the atmosphere calm, but in the world of aviation, calm skies often hold hidden dangers. The aircraft was piloted by a seasoned crew. Captain Edward Connors, a man with over 29,000 flight hours, was known for his composed demeanor and sharp instincts. He was accompanied by First Officer Rudolph Price and Flight Engineer Nick Nozick, both experienced professionals. Together, they formed a team equipped to handle any challenge the skies could throw their way, or so they believed. As passengers settled into their seats, the atmosphere was relaxed. Families chatted, business travelers reviewed documents, and a few passengers closed their eyes for a brief respite. Among them was 12-year-old Andy Stevens, eagerly anticipating his first visit to Disneyland. Beside him, his mother smiled as she flipped through a magazine, blissfully unaware of what was to come. The Lockheed L-1011 TriStar was a symbol of modern aviation. Equipped with advanced safety features, the aircraft inspired confidence in both passengers and crew. Its three-engine design and sophisticated navigation systems made it a favorite for long-haul flight. But even the most advanced technology cannot predict or prevent the wrath of nature. High above the earth, invisible forces were already gathering. As Flight 191 approached Dallas-Fort Worth, the crew began their preparations for landing. The sky ahead appeared clear, but meteorological reports hinted at scattered thunderstorms in the area. In the cockpit, Captain Connors studied the instruments, his years of experience telling him to remain cautious. First Officer Price and Flight Engineer Nozick worked in seamless coordination, their trust in one another implicit and unspoken. In the cabin, the flight attendants prepared for the final approach. Coffee cups were collected, trays stowed, and seat belts checked. Passengers gazed out the windows, watching the sprawling Texas landscape come into view. The mood was light, conversations mingling with the hum of the engines. For many, this was just another flight. But nature, unpredictable and relentless, had other plans. As the aircraft descended, a powerful thunderstorm system loomed in the distance, its energy growing by the second. This storm was not ordinary. It harbored a force that was poorly understood at the time, a microburst, capable of overwhelming even the most experienced pilots and sophisticated aircraft. The crew of Flight 191, trained to handle adversity, now faced an invisible enemy. What they didn't yet realize was that this encounter would test the limits of their skill and the resilience of their aircraft. The passengers, oblivious to the growing danger, continued their conversations, unaware that the final moments of their journey would become a defining chapter in aviation history. The aircraft descended steadily toward Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, its engines humming smoothly as the crew prepared for landing. At first glance, everything seemed routine. Captain Connors and his team followed standard procedures, communicating with air traffic control to adjust their approach. The weather reports, while noting isolated thunderstorms in the area, did not suggest any immediate threat. But nature often hides its most dangerous forces until it's too late. Inside the cockpit, the crew remained focused. Captain Connors monitored the instruments while First Officer Price coordinated with air traffic control. Flight Engineer Sik kept a close eye on the aircraft's systems, ensuring everything was functioning perfectly. Their professionalism was evident in the calm, precise way they communicated, a routine day at work for a seasoned team. Passengers began to stir as the aircraft started its descent. Some gathered their belongings, preparing for the layover in Dallas, while others gazed out the windows at the sprawling Texas landscape. In row 17, Andy Stevens pressed his face against the window, pointing out landmarks to his mother. The sense of anticipation was palpable as the aircraft neared its destination. The calm inside the cabin belied the brewing storm outside. As Flight 191 approached its final approach path, it entered an area of increasingly unstable air. The thunderstorms that had seemed distant were now encroaching on the airport, their dark clouds rolling ominously across the horizon. These storms were no ordinary weather phenomena. They contained microbursts, violent downdrafts capable of wreaking havoc on even the most advanced aircraft. At 6 p.m., air traffic control cleared Delta Flight 191 for its approach to runway 17L. The crew acknowledged the clearance, their voices steady over the radio. The cockpit crew initiated the final landing procedures, adjusting flaps and throttles as the aircraft descended through 5,000 feet. It was at this altitude that the first signs of trouble appeared. First Officer Price noticed subtle fluctuations in the airspeed indicator, a potential sign of wind shear. "We're getting some variation in airspeed," he reported calmly to Captain Connors. The captain nodded, his focus sharpening. Wind shear was a known hazard during thunderstorms, but it was also unpredictable. The crew adjusted their approach slightly, hoping to counteract the turbulence. As the aircraft continued its descent, the cockpit instruments began to register more erratic readings. The airspeed fluctuated wildly, and the aircraft experienced sudden jolts as it passed through layers of unstable air. What the crew didn't yet know was that they were entering the core of a powerful microburst, a phenomenon that had claimed numerous lives in previous aviation accidents. "Stabilizers fine. Engines are holding," reported Flight Engineer Sik, scanning his instruments for abnormalities. Despite his assurances, the growing turbulence suggested otherwise. Captain Connors gripped the yoke tightly, his calm demeanor masking the intensity of his concentration. "Stay on it," he told Price, his voice clipped but controlled. At 6:04 p.m., just 800 feet above the ground, the microburst struck with full force. A sudden, violent downdraft slammed into the aircraft, pushing it toward the ground with terrifying speed. Inside the cockpit, alarms blared as the altitude indicator plummeted. "Pull up!" Connors shouted, applying maximum thrust in an attempt to counteract the descent. The passengers were jolted violently in their seats as the aircraft pitched upward, struggling to escape the microburst's grip. The cabin filled with gasps and cries as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Flight attendants, bracing themselves against the sudden turbulence, shouted instructions to the passengers. "Stay seated. Keep your seat belts on." In the cockpit, the crew fought desperately to regain control. The aircraft's nose pointed skyward as the engines roared, but the microburst's downdraft continued to overpower their efforts. For a brief moment it seemed they might escape. The aircraft climbed slightly, its altitude stabilizing. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the upward motion ceased. The microburst delivered a final, devastating blow, a powerful tailwind that robbed the aircraft of its remaining lift. At an altitude of just 150 feet, the aircraft's nose dropped, and it began its final, irreversible descent. Captain Connors issued one last command: brace for impact. Seconds later, Delta Flight 191 struck the ground. The left wingtip hit first, slicing into a water tank on the airport's perimeter. The force of the impact tore the wing from the fuselage, igniting a massive fireball that engulfed the rear section of the aircraft. The main body of the plane skidded across the ground, breaking apart as it went, until it finally came to rest in a field near the runway. The scene was one of utter devastation. Fire and smoke billowed into the evening sky, visible for miles around. Inside the fractured fuselage, survivors struggled to make sense of what had just happened. The crash had occurred in mere seconds, but for those on board, it felt like an eternity. The cockpit crew, despite their best efforts, had been unable to save the aircraft. Their final moments were marked by an extraordinary display of skill and courage, a desperate attempt to save as many lives as possible. In the cabin, passengers and flight attendants worked together to assist the injured and escape the wreckage, their survival instincts kicking in amidst the chaos. At the Dallas-Fort Worth control tower, air traffic controllers watched in horror as the fireball erupted on the edge of the runway. Emergency services were dispatched immediately, their sirens piercing the air as they raced toward the crash site. The rescue effort was about to begin, but for many, it was already too late. The fiery wreckage of Delta Flight 191 lay scattered across the outskirts of Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, a grim testament to the destructive power of nature and the desperate fight for survival. Smoke billowed from the shattered fuselage, rising into the evening sky and visible for miles. The scene was chaotic yet eerily silent, interrupted only by the distant wail of approaching sirens. For those still alive inside the wreckage, every second was a battle against time, fire, and injury. As the main body of the aircraft came to a halt, passengers who had survived the initial impact began to stir. The fuselage was fractured into several pieces, with the tail section engulfed in flames. Those near the front of the plane had a higher chance of survival, shielded from the worst of the fireball that consumed the rear. The smell of jet fuel filled the air, adding to the overwhelming sense of urgency. In the forward cabin, passengers struggled to free themselves from their seat. Many were dazed, their movements sluggish as they tried to process what had just happened. Others acted instinctively, unbuckling their seatbelts and calling out for loved ones. A young man in his 20s, seated near an emergency exit, took charge, shouting, "This way! Follow me!" as he pulled open the exit door, letting in the acrid air from outside. In row 17, Andy Stevens sat frozen, his face pale and his hands trembling. His mother, bleeding from a cut on her forehead, unbuckled his seatbelt and urged him to move. "We have to go now, Andy." "Come on," she said, her voice firm but trembling. Her maternal instincts overpowered her own fear as she guided her son toward the exit. At the rear of the aircraft, the situation was far more dire. Flames had already consumed much of the tail section, trapping those who had survived the impact. Flight attendant Deborah Smith, despite being injured, remained in her seat to assist passengers. Her voice cut through the chaos as she shouted, "Stay low. Crawl forward." She knew the odds were slim, but her training compelled her to help until the very last moment. For Captain Connors, First Officer Price, and Flight Engineer Nas Sick, the cockpit had become a crumpled shell. The impact had crushed the forward section of the aircraft, pinning them in their seat. Connors, still conscious, groaned as he struggled to free his legs from the twisted metal. "Price, are you there?" he called out, his voice weak but urgent. "Here, barely," Price replied, his voice faint. Flight Engineer Nas Sick remained unresponsive, slumped over his console. The three men, who had fought so valiantly to save the aircraft, now faced their own battle for survival. Emergency services arrived within minutes of the crash, their vehicles forming a perimeter around the wreckage. Firefighters worked quickly to douse the flames, their hoses spraying arcs of water over the burning aircraft. Medics rushed to the survivors, setting up triage stations in the nearby field to assess injuries and provide immediate care. Rescue teams entered the smoldering fuselage, braving the heat and unstable structure to search for survivors. They called out as they moved through the wreckage, "Is anyone alive? Call out if you can hear us." Their voices echoed through the shattered interior, a lifeline for those still clinging to life. Among the first rescued was Andy Stevens and his mother. A firefighter carried Andy out of the wreckage, his soot-covered face streaked with tears. His mother followed closely behind, limping but alive. As they were led to the triage area, she clutched her son tightly, refusing to let go. In the cockpit, rescuers worked to free Captain Connors and First Officer Price. Using hydraulic tools, they pried open the crumpled metal to create an opening. Connors, severely injured but conscious, was the first to be extracted. He refused treatment until his co-pilot and flight engineer were also freed, his sense of responsibility unwavering even in his weakened state. Meanwhile, passengers in the midsection of the aircraft formed makeshift rescue teams, helping one another climb out through broken windows and emergency exit. An elderly man, unable to walk, was carried out by two younger passengers who refused to leave him behind. Their actions, born of instinct and compassion, exemplified the resilience of the human spirit in the face of catastrophe. Despite the heroic efforts of the rescue teams, the devastation was immense. Of the 163 people on board, 27 lost their lives on impact, and several more succumbed to their injuries in the hours that followed. The survivors, though grateful to be alive, carried the scars, both physical and emotional, of the tragedy. At Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, the crash sent shockwaves through the aviation community. In the control tower, air traffic controllers who had guided Flight 191 on its final approach stood in stunned silence. Many had witnessed the crash firsthand, the image of the fireball seared into their memories. News of the disaster spread quickly, drawing national and international attention. Television networks interrupted their broadcasts to report on the tragedy, showing aerial footage of the wreckage and rescue operations. Families of the passengers anxiously awaited updates, their lives thrown into turmoil by the uncertainty of their loved one's fate. In the days that followed, investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board (NTSB) arrived at the scene. They meticulously examined every piece of debris, determined to uncover the cause of the crash. The scattered wreckage and the cockpit voice recorder would reveal the story of what happened in those fateful final moments. For the survivors, the crash marked the beginning of a long journey toward healing. Many suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted by memories of the impact, the fire, and the cries for help. Support groups formed, offering a sense of community and understanding for those who had endured the unimaginable. Captain Connors, though hailed as a hero for his efforts, struggled with guilt over the lives lost. In interviews, he often reflected on the microburst, a force of nature so powerful and unpredictable that it left even the most experienced pilots powerless. "We did everything we could," he would say, his voice tinged with sorrow. "But sometimes nature wins." In the days following the crash of Delta Flight 191, a sense of urgency gripped investigators as they sought to unravel the events leading to the tragedy. The National Transportation Safety Board (NTSB) swiftly dispatched a team of experts to the crash site near Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. Their mission was to determine the cause of the crash and prevent such a disaster from happening again. The wreckage of the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, spread across a field and airport perimeter, presented a haunting scene. The tail section, charred beyond recognition, remained partially submerged in the water from the destroyed tank it had struck. The fuselage, fragmented into sections, bore the marks of a catastrophic impact. Investigators carefully examined the aircraft's remains, documenting every detail to reconstruct the sequence of events. The cockpit voice recorder, CVR, and flight data recorder, FDR, recovered from the wreckage became critical to the investigation. These black boxes would reveal the final moments of the flight, capturing the crew's conversations, instrument readings, and the rapid sequence of events that led to the crash. The role of the microburst. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that a powerful microburst, a sudden and intense downdraft of air, was the primary cause of the crash. At the time, microbursts were poorly understood phenomena, but they were known to be among the most dangerous weather conditions a pilot could encounter during takeoff or landing. The CVR captured the crew's realization of the wind shear and their desperate attempts to counteract it. The FDR revealed how the microburst first pushed the aircraft downward with overwhelming force, followed by a sudden tailwind that robbed the plane of lift. Despite the crew's efforts to regain control, the microburst's intensity proved insurmountable. Meteorologists studying the weather patterns on August 2, 1985, noted that the thunderstorm near DFW had created ideal conditions for a microburst. The storm's downdraft accelerated as it reached the ground, spreading outward in a deadly horizontal wind. Unfortunately, Delta Flight 191 had flown directly into this invisible hazard during its final approach. The challenges of detection. One of the investigation's most alarming findings was the lack of adequate tools to detect microbursts in real time. While modern radar systems could identify larger storm cells, the rapid and localized nature of microbursts made them almost impossible to detect with the technology available in 1985. Pilots relied on their training and instincts, but even the most experienced crew could be caught off guard. The NTSB's final report highlighted the need for advancements in wind shear detection technology. Investigators called for the development of systems capable of identifying microbursts and alerting pilots before they encountered these deadly conditions. Pilot performance and crew resource management. Despite the tragic outcome, the NTSB praised the efforts of Captain Edward Connors and his crew. The report noted their quick decision-making and coordination during the crisis, emphasizing that they had followed all standard procedures. The investigators acknowledged that the microburst severity had left the crew with no viable options. The report also underscored the importance of crew resource management, CRM, a training methodology that emphasizes teamwork and communication in the cockpit. The CRM practices demonstrated by the crew of Flight 191 became a case study for future training programs, highlighting the value of clear communication and collective problem-solving under pressure. Impact on aviation safety. The Delta Flight 191 tragedy became a turning point in aviation safety, leading to significant changes in how the industry approached weather-related hazard. Among the most important outcomes were wind shear detection technology. The development and implementation of Doppler radar systems capable of detecting microbursts became a top priority. By the early 1990s, these systems were installed at major airports across the United States, providing pilots and air traffic controllers with real-time warnings of wind shear activity. Pilot training enhancements. Airlines revamped their training programs to include more comprehensive wind shear scenarios. Simulators were updated to replicate the effects of microbursts, allowing pilots to practice responses in a controlled environment. Weather awareness programs. The Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, launched initiatives to improve weather reporting and forecasting. Enhanced communication between meteorologists, air traffic controllers, and pilots became standard practice. Infrastructure improvements. Airports invested in improved runway lighting, weather monitoring stations, and emergency response systems to better handle adverse weather conditions. The human cost. For the families of the 137 victims, the crash of Delta Flight 191 left an indelible mark. Loved ones mourned their loss while grappling with questions about what had gone wrong. Delta Airlines offered financial compensation to the victims' families and established support programs to help them navigate their grief. Survivors faced their own challenges, many of them struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and physical injuries. Andy Stevens, who had survived alongside his mother, became a symbol of resilience, but his journey toward recovery was long and fraught with emotional scars. Captain Connors, hailed by some as a hero for his efforts, carried the weight of the tragedy for the rest of his life. In interviews, he often spoke of the microburst as a force beyond human control, emphasizing the lessons learned and the need for continued vigilance in aviation safety. The legacy of Delta Flight 191. The crash of Delta Flight 191 became a defining moment in aviation history. It underscored the unpredictability of nature and the importance of technological innovation in safeguarding lives. The changes spurred by the tragedy transformed how the industry approached weather-related hazards, making air travel safer for millions of passengers. The legacy of Flight 191 is also one of resilience and courage. The passengers, crew, and rescuers who faced the unimaginable that day demonstrated the strength of the human spirit in the face of adversity. Their stories continue to inspire improvements in safety and remind us of the sacrifices made to make flying one of the safest modes of transportation today. In the years following the tragedy, aviation experts and historians revisited the events of August 2, 1985, using them as a case study to educate future generations of pilots, engineers, and air traffic controllers. The lessons of Delta Flight 191 endure, ensuring that the skies remain a safer place for all who traverse them.